As you, I'm sure all know, tonight I'm talking about some FCC rules that were changed, and it took them a little while to get there. They started making these changes a long time ago. 2013 was a big date, and then people left the FCC and came back, and administrations changed, so priorities changed. Eventually, the person who's in charge of it now finally put this all together. The changes he made are not major. A lot of people are very concerned and don't need to be. And especially if you've been keeping up with this for the past 20 years since it started, you'll see that there's not much to worry about. Let's see if I can, there we go. So let me tell you about me. My name is Greg Lappin. I have a doctorate in electrical engineering, and I'm also a professional engineer. My call is N9GL, but I have been KD9AZ and WA1NUK and WN1NUK, first licensed in 1970. I chair the ARRL RF Safety Committee, which is the group that does RF safety, and we interface with the FCC, and we try and keep the whole ham world up to date with what they should be doing to stay safe. I'm also a member of the IEEE Committee on Man and Radiation, which is over at IEEE, something that does something similar to that. And I belong to the FCC's Technological Advisory Council. I've been doing that for about 20 years. We meet 4 times in Washington, and we advise the FCC on what they want to be advised on, which changes at least every 4 years. I consult on RF exposure issues, and one of my email addresses is there that you can always get me on. So in 1998, the first FCC exposure rules became effective for hams. They were written in 1996, and like now, they gave them 2 years to come up to speed, the hams. So in 1998, January 1st, these went into effect for the very first time, and nobody knew what to do at that time, and there was no Zoom. So for the very first time, radio amateurs were introduced to this topic, and so the league published, we threw together very quickly a book. Ed Hare was the author, and we all helped him write it, RF Exposure and You. Very helpful book for anyone who needed to know how to check the exposure from their station. Now that book is no longer in print, but there's a PDF available, and here's the link, and I'll be sending this out. If you go onto the ARRL website and just do a search for RF Exposure and You, you'll be able to find it. But this is the actual link to the book. FCC didn't do much with those rules. And they made some minor rule changes in 2013, but none of them affected radio amateurs. In 2020, April 1st, the FCC published new rule changes that were going to take effect June 1st. They then had, COVID was going on at that time, and all the different agencies of the government weren't talking very well. And I think I forget who held them up, but they were held up because of some paperwork reduction stuff that they didn't do. So they got delayed, and eventually the delay ended on, and will end on May 3rd, 2021, in a few weeks. Like before, they give existing stations that were following the old rules until May 3rd, 2023, 2 years to comply. But they have emphasized that new or changed stations after May 3rd, 2021 must comply immediately. Now the rule changes that they did, the purpose of this rule change was to take all the different services that the FCC controls, every single one, with AM radio, FM radio, television, cell phones, everybody, and give them all the same set of rules. There used to be kind of a fragmented set of rules that each different service followed, and they wanted to make it the same for everybody. So that was a big part of this change. So all these different parts of the FCC rules, 1, 2, 15, 18, et cetera, had changes in them. Our service, amateur radio, is affected by parts 1, 2, and 97. So those are the ones that change for us. The biggest change is the categorical exclusion. Early on, they thought that there are certain situations when hams, or anyone for that matter, would have a really hard time overexposing anyone to RF. So they set that up just to make it easy for us. And they said also mobile transmitters are very hard to do analysis on because it has to be done a different way. I'm going to talk about that later. So they knew that hams couldn't do that themselves, so they excluded the mobile transmitters as well. They took those away in these new rules, the categorical exclusions. I'll show you what they were and then show you what they are. And they put in new exemptions. They changed the wording from exclusion to exemption. And the new exemptions make a lot more sense. It was actually easier under the old rules to overexpose someone than it is now. As a ridiculous example, if you have an HT, which was excluded from analysis, so nobody really cared about it because it was excluded. And I'll talk about how that's a mistake. But let's say you were to put the antenna of your HT, the rubber duck, in your mouth and then transmit. Clearly, I don't think anyone would argue that that's an overexposure. Even without doing the measurements or calculations, you know that's going to be an overexposure from a 5-watt HT. So the new exemptions take into account other things, including the amount of power and the distance, as well as the frequency. The old one was just amount of power and frequency. So distance to a person became important. They also changed something where all transmitters within 20 centimeters of the body must be evaluated with SAR. SAR is a measure of the actual absorption of RF in your body, inside the body. Very hard to measure because it's inside your body. They do accept modeling, but even that modeling is hard to do compared to the modeling that we do. Say if you've done EasyNeck, you know that EasyNeck is not too terrible, but the SAR modeling uses special software, which is not cheap, and it's not easy to do. Some things have not changed. The FCC rules did not change any of the limits. So there are various limits or thresholds at different frequencies that you should not exceed. This is a graph of the limits for it's called maximum permissible exposure. That's energy you can measure outside the body. And obviously it's easier to measure or model outside the body than it is inside the body. They have the same SAR limits. The amount of energy or power, watts, per kilogram of tissue, averaged over the whole body is still the same, 0.4 watts. 8 watts averaged over a gram of tissue, that's the same. And 20 watts average over 10 grams of tissue in some of the extremities, the hands, the wrists, the feet, the ankles, things that aren't quite so sensitive. Hams and their families are still considered to be in the occupational or controlled exposure category. There are two categories. Anyone who's trained in what exposure is and how it happens is in the controlled group. And we as hams were considered to be in that controlled group. That's important for us because they have higher limits. So we are allowed to expose ourselves more than we are to some person just walking down the street. That's the general population group. And that's pretty important for us because we can control our own exposure, and in theory, we've been trained. Now, the FCC accepted training as pretty much what RF Safety Committee tells you, and also because there is at least one question in every question pool that must be answered on this topic. So they're considering that to be enough training to put all hams in the controlled group. Hams are expected to perform their own exposure analyses. And nobody's going to come and tell you to do it. You have to do it yourself. And you don't have to submit the results to the FCC. You're trusted to have done it and to do it right. Now, put that aside, you are trusted, but should something happen, let's say a neighbor who you don't get along with especially, or who doesn't like your antenna and wants to get rid of it, writes to the FCC and says, I think that ham radio antenna next door to me is endangering my life or endangering my kid's life. And the FCC will take those kind of complaints seriously. They'll come to you, ask you for your analysis, your exposure analysis. If you show it to them and you show that your neighbor is not being overexposed, they'll just accept it and tell the neighbor there's no health issues to you. And that'll be the end of that. Now, let me go back about what was in the old rules. The previous categorical exclusions were per band. On 160 meters, if you did not transmit more than 500 watts, and that's 500 watts at the antenna, entering the antenna. So after your transmitter generates its power, and then you get your losses in the feed line, that's the 500 watts. 80 meters, 75 meters, 40 meters, all 500 watts. If you're not transmitting more than 500 watts, you were not required to do this environmental evaluation. With frequency, as the frequency goes up, the body becomes more able to absorb it, and so the limits are set lower. So 30 meters with 425 watts, 20 meters, 225 watts, and again, not so much of a problem as I believe that most hams, or at least looking at most of the radios that are sold, are 100 watt radios. So most hams never even paid attention to this. 125 watts at 17 meters, 100 watts at 15 meters. So the person at 15 meters still didn't need to do with a regular ICOM or Yaesu radio or Kenwood, didn't need to do the analysis. 12 meters, 10 meters you did at VHF, 50 watts. I don't know how much most people run at VHF, but I've never run more than 50 watts. Then as the frequency gets higher and higher, now your body is not resonant. Your body is mostly resonant in the low to mid to high VHF region. And then as you get to UHF and higher, your body's less resonant, so it doesn't penetrate as far. And as the frequency gets higher and higher, the penetration into your body gets lower and lower. So you've probably heard all the commotion about 5G, because 5G is using some frequencies up in the tens of gigahertz. Well, tens of gigahertz barely penetrate below the skin surface. So a lot of people are concerned about that, and I don't really believe there's a good reason for that concern. So in addition to those exclusions, hams were also not required to do environmental assessments on their mobiles, portables, or any unlicensed transmitting devices. That's not so much an issue for us. So they were also excluded. So it's very likely that, first of all, that no one has ever measured the SAR of your HT or your mobile rig. Since it's hard for any ham to do that, you'd hope the manufacturer would, but we do not really think that any of the manufacturers did, because they weren't required to, and it's expensive. Okay, so let's talk about the caveat. When I last communicated with the FCC, they made sure that I was going to mention this. And this is something that they are very insistent about. So categorical exclusions were meant to simplify the lives of hams by identifying a situation where overexposure is unlikely. And again, like I gave that ridiculous example of sticking the HT in your mouth. It's ridiculous, but if it happens, that's an overexposure. So you have to avoid it. It should be obvious to everyone that it's still possible to have an overexposure. Like I said, but even at HF, let's say you have a 10-meter antenna and it's a vertical, so it's ground mounted vertical, and someone goes and stands right next to it. That can cause an overexposure. So you have to be aware of that. And the FCC says whether they require you to do, and this is a bit of a paradox, but whether they require you to do an assessment or not, they state in these words, no station is exempt from compliance with the FCC's rules and with the MPE limits. In other words, if you do just what the rules tell you, in other words, you don't do an exposure assessment because you're transmitting a 100-watt radio on frequencies that don't require it at 100 watts, and then someone walks right next to your antenna or touches it or whatever, you're still responsible. So there's a little bit of a paradox, but that's how they're thinking about this. They're trying to make your life a little easier, but they still don't want anyone to get overexposed. So what does the change mean for hams? If you performed an environmental assessment on your station in the past, since none of those limits changed, it still applies and you're all done. You have already complied with the new requirements. If, however, there was a categorical exclusion applied to you and you didn't perform the environmental assessment, now you may need to do so. So again, the categorical exclusion was based on power entering the antenna for each band. And as we went through that table, there are an awful lot of bands where people probably just ignored it because they thought they could. So the categorical exclusions have been replaced by exemptions. So hams were the only ones with categorical exclusions before. Now every service has an exemption. So let's talk about the exemptions. Let me mention the other categorical exclusion before I go on. Mobile radios and of course handhelds were categorically excluded. I explained why, because they're very hard to measure. The new exemptions are based on distance from the antenna to the body, but they say outright anything less than 20 centimeters away from your body must be measured or modeled with SAR. And like I said before, that's not something that you're going to be able to do, most likely. SAR is very complicated to either measure or model. And the SAR exemptions, there are exemptions where you can do calculations, but they're only valid for frequencies above 300 megahertz. So the 2-meter HT is kind of a conundrum. And we've talked to them about that, and there will be nothing to worry about in the immediate change. The new exemptions, though, are based on 3 things: frequency, maximum ERP, so that takes into account both the feed line loss, which works in your favor, and the antenna gain, which works against you. Distance between a person and any part of the antenna, and they do not allow you to take exemptions in the reactive near field, which is essentially, if you measure the wavelength divided by 2 pi, that's roughly where the reactive near field ends from the antenna. And that's where it's very unclear. It's not like a plane wave as you get into the far field and everything's pretty uniform across space. In the reactive near field, it's not, so they don't want you to use the exemptions for someone getting that close to your antenna. So the exemptions still require less calculation than a full exposure analysis, but they do require more calculation than before. If you don't qualify for an exemption, you can still perform a full analysis, and that takes into account many things, which also includes the transmit receive duty cycle, which is the thing that saves an awful lot of hams from not being able to operate. So let me talk about doing the new exemptions. There's an exemption table at all frequencies. And again, we're looking at different frequency ranges. So you have the VLF, you have the HF, you have VHF, you have UHF and above, and then you have the millimeter wave and way up there. But look, so frequencies in megahertz are distance from any part of a body to any part of the antenna is in meters. And if you look at these equations, all of HF follows this one equation, and I'm going to do an example that shows how we use it. Also, there's an exemption for SAR. Now, these equations are a little more complicated. By the way, do you see my cursor as I'm waving it around here?
No.
You don't see this?
No.
Oh, okay. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Where I need to put my cursor. Yeah, I thought I was being clever getting two screens. So if your antenna is closer to 40 centimeters to a person and your frequency is greater than 300 megahertz, exceeding the levels in the following formulas determines if you have to do an SAR evaluation. So you can avoid an SAR evaluation by just running the distances and the power thresholds and the ERP, the same parameters, through these much more complicated equations. But if you fall within those limits, then you can avoid doing an SAR evaluation. But again, that's at UHF and above. So it won't affect every ham. But let's take this equation, because I'll concentrate on HF mostly, and do an example. So here's my example. This is my own example, and it's real. So I have a multiband vertical antenna. It covers 20 to 10 meters. And it's mounted, it's ground plane vertical, mounted in my yard. And where I mounted it, there's a sidewalk that's 15 feet, which is, since we have to measure in 5 meters, it's about 5 meters away from my antenna. So you assume the people are going to walk down the sidewalk, and they will be exposed to your antenna if you're operating at the same time. I have a 100-watt transmitter, and I use 50 feet of RG58 to feed that antenna. So I want to check if I qualify for an exception. So I use the table from the last slide, and the same equation applies for all bands on my vertical. And this is it. Maximum ERP equals 3450 times the distance in meters squared divided by the frequency in megahertz squared. But to simplify, because I don't want to have to recalculate this equation, I'm going to be a little lazy. I see in this equation that my maximum ERP decreases pretty fast, it increases pretty fast as the frequency increases. Because the equation includes an F squared. So if I do my calculations at 10 megahertz, and let's say the highest frequency in 10 megahertz, then this should apply for all the other bands as well that this antenna covers. Now, if you don't believe that, you can try one of the other ones and you'll see that you're allowed to transmit much more power on those other bands just because you're dividing by a much smaller number. So
Greg,
ERP is, yes.
Greg, I think you meant 10 meters.
Didn't I say 10 meters?
You said 10 megahertz.
I'm sorry, I meant 10 meters. You're absolutely right. Thank you. Okay, so again, this antenna is a 20 to 10 meter antenna. 10 meter band is the highest frequencies. So what I need to first determine is my maximum ERP that I'm allowed to transmit from that antenna. So I use the highest frequency, the top of the 10 meter band, 29.7 megahertz, and I plug it into my equation. My sidewalk is 5 meters away. The number 3450 is the constant that they supply. So 3450 times 5 squared, 25, divided by 29.7 squared, and we run that, and it says that the maximum ERP that I can have from my antenna is 97.8 watts. I've got a 100-watt transmitter, but the ERP is calculated by the transmitter power output minus the feed line loss, and then you multiply that difference times the antenna gain. So 50 feet of RG58 at 29.7 megahertz has about 1 dB of loss. So that's a 22% of the power being lost in the coax. The ground plane vertical is a 0 dBd gain, so the gain factor there is 1. So to calculate my ERP, I take my 100 watts from the transmitter. For those of you old enough, you remember when we used to have to do the input to the final stage of the transmitter and then figure out what the output was, but we don't have to do that anymore. Transmit is rated at 100 watts output. I'm losing 22 watts in my coax, and then I multiply it by a gain of 1, so I end up with a 78 watt ERP from this antenna. Well, I'm allowed to radiate 97.8 watts with people walking on that sidewalk. And since my ERP is 78 watts, I'm golden. This antenna qualifies for the exception. I don't have to do anything else with this antenna. Now let's do some more with that. If I change anything, the antenna position moving closer to the sidewalk, if I increase my transmitter power, if I go get some better coax so I don't lose so much power in it, I would have to recalculate and see if the exception still applies. But let's do something else. Let's try and figure out, using the same equation, how close can I put the antenna to the sidewalk and still retain my exception? So I rearrange the equation a little bit. So I'm solving for the distance now, and that equals the square root of the ERP times this frequency squared divided by the constant, 3450. And if I run all my numbers, it says my antenna could be 4.5 meters from the sidewalk, and I would still get this exception. The people walking down there would not have to worry about being over irradiated. So I could move my antenna half a meter closer to the sidewalk and still be able to claim the exception. So you could do this either way. You could figure out what you got and then figure out how far away you have to put your antenna so that you get the exception. Or you can figure out where your antenna is mounted and figure out how much power you're allowed to transmit through it. Either way works. Okay, so what happens if I can't claim the exception? What happens if I run all the numbers and I'm not allowed to claim the exception? If my ERP that I calculated was lower than my 78 watts. So several possibilities. One is I never go above 28.6 megahertz on 10 meters, so I could recalculate it with that frequency and I would gain a little bit of ERP. Again, because my frequency is going down. So I'm dividing by a smaller number. I could, so that's a more realistic calculation. And then after I did that, I could not turn my VFO higher than 28.6 megahertz, but I'm willing to accept that. I could move my antenna farther away from the sidewalk, or I could just perform a full evaluation. It's not as horrible as a lot of people think it is, because the exceptions are very conservative. I'm sorry, I'm there. The exceptions are very conservative. If I calculate the actual exposure of people on the sidewalk, I'll find that it is less than the exception allows for. Because they don't really take everything into account for the exception, they're just trying to be conservatively safe so that nobody on the sidewalk could possibly be over irradiated. One large difference that every ham can take advantage of is averaging time. None of us talks constantly. I won't say none of us, but most of us don't talk constantly. And the average ham will listen as much as he or she talks. So that means that because averaging is factored into the standards for safety, and for the public, it's a 30-minute average. So the total transmitted time divided by 30 minutes tells you a factor that you can put into the amount of exposure the person has had. So let's say 50-50 is reasonable. And some people, the way they operate, if you're going after rare DX, you probably transmit much less than 50% of the time. You do a lot of listening. In contesting, I think it may be a little less than 50%. I'm not really sure, but rag chewing, let's say it's 50%. So if you find out, say that where your antenna is placed and with the power you're using, that you're higher than is allowed in the exception, once you do the averaging time by doing a full evaluation, you find that right there your exposure drops in half. So you're going to come out ahead most of the time just with that simple part of the calculation. Another part of the calculation is if you use a directional antenna, the exception assumes that gain is true all around the antenna. But if you're using a Yagi, it's really only true where the Yagi is pointed. If you know you're never going to point it in the direction that people are going to be, then, which may not be realistic, but if you know you're not going to do it, then you can, in a full evaluation, you can do that. You can put that in and say that no person is going to be exposed to the full gain of this antenna, and you can use the actual gain of the sides or the back. There are a lot of different calculations in reality that will save your exposure analysis. Now, let me go back to that thing that they were talking about with the lambda over 2 pi, that's the reactive near field. And I just went through and calculated it for a lot of bands. And it is pretty substantial. On 160 meters, it's 82.8 feet. People might actually be in the reactive near field of your 160 meter transmitter. 80 meters, 41.3 feet. Even if you have a dipole up in the air, if it's not more than 41.3 feet, people walking under it are in that reactive near field. This means you can't use the exception on 80 meters, if that's the case. 75 meters, pretty much the same. 40 meters, probably don't have your 40 meter antenna or dipole mounted lower than 20 feet, but depending where you live, you may have to. And as you see, this reactive near field gets closer to the antenna as the frequency goes up. And when you hit, or when you get above 222 megahertz, the 1.25 meter band, then above that, then your reactive near field is inside the 20 centimeter limit that requires SAR testing. So that's UHF, 70 centimeters, the 900 megahertz and higher than that. So all of those, 20 centimeters is your limit, not the lambda over 2 pi. So all those require SAR. But you see on some of these, you may not be able to use your exceptions because the wavelengths are so long that people could be in the reactive near field. So we keep that in, and you may have noticed that in the example I gave, my vertical did not have 80, 160, 80, 40, or 30 meters on it. just for that reason. I didn't want to mess up my example calculations. Okay, so let's go back and talk about the 2 meter HT. 2 meter HT is an anomaly in these new rules. It's not covered under the new exemptions at all. Its antennas within 20 centimeters of your head, and its frequency is less than 300 megahertz, so you can't use the SAR exemptions. And we also note that no known SAR tests have been performed with amateur HTs. Again, because it costs money and the companies don't want to spend that money if they don't have to. And hams are not likely to be able to do it themselves. So what are we going to do? Well, the FCC came out with a ruling, and this we had clarified a couple of times just to make sure. So any newly produced amateur HT, and by new it means after May 3rd, 2021, will have to be characterized by their manufacturers for SAR. So they'll have to do what they're doing for their commercial HTs, for ham HTs too. Amateur HTs manufactured before the rule change on May 3rd, 2021 are being grandfathered in. So the HT that you have at home and the one that's on the shelf at the store that was made before, those are all acceptable. They're all, they all meet the rules because of this grandfathering. So we don't need to worry about those. Anything that's newly manufactured, it's going to have to be the responsibility of the manufacturer. So going forward, how do hams follow the rules? New rules have been released with a 2-year transition period for existing stations. That was a nice thing the FCC did. It really is not going to change very much for most hams because it's not that hard to do an assessment. You're not going to need 2 years to perform your environmental assessments, but this keeps you legal for those 2 years in case you don't get to it. The FCC has 2 documents for hams. One's called OET Bulletin 65. These are both on the web at the FCC website, fcc.gov/OET. And OET Bulletin 65 Supplement B was written specifically for radio amateurs. And they are being revised. Our ARRL RF Safety Committee is working with the FCC to revise the documents. And we are also working on finding or developing tools that all hams can use to perform exposure assessments. Some of the tools are very simple to use, some are less so. It depends on what type of antenna you're using. So we're going to analyze that and figure out just what everyone needs to do. Let me talk a little about modeling because SAR, I'll talk about that next and show you what it takes to do it, but modeling, there are really 3 types of modeling: NEC, numerical electromagnetic code, finite difference time domain, FDTD, and FEM, finite element analysis. The NEC is something that most hams have access to. The easy NEC is one of the forms of NEC that there are free versions of it and slightly better ones that are fairly cheap. LNEC is one of the NECs, a mini NEC, and Easy NEC is something that you may have on your computer right now. But that is a way to do modeling. It does not model SAR, but it will let you model the MPEs, the maximum permissible exposure values, which are measured outside the body or calculated outside the body. Finite difference time domain is a much more intensive program that is expensive to get, like in the thousands of dollars, and it's not easy to use once you have it. And then finite element analysis is similar to FDTD. It's expensive and it's not easy to use. Modeling has to take into account patterns in the near field and in the far field. Far field's a little easier, but the near field is sometimes very unstable depending on the type of antenna you have. You have hot spots and you have nulls. So you have to look for the hottest spot in the near field that a person might be and assume that person will be in the hot spot and do the analysis of their absorption. The SAR modeling accounts for energy absorption in tissue. It actually models the tissue itself. So the model has to be realistic absorption in the body. The companies that make the radios that are required for commercial radios to do SAR modeling, and now will be required to do SAR modeling for ham radios, or at least ham HTs that are closer than 20 centimeters, they spend a lot of money on that. And they make back that money, obviously, in selling lots of radios. But that could lead to some price increase in radios if they're required to do so. But it's not something that you or I are going to be able to do. So let's talk a little more about SAR. It's defined as the rate at which energy is absorbed by tissue. And that really is how you determine if someone is going to be hurt by your energy or not. The amount of tissue that you average over can be 1 gram, 10 grams, or the whole body, depending on the type of exposure. The FCC uses 1 gram for most of their exposures. The result is typically in watts of power per kilogram. So it's absorption of watts per kilogram, which turns into heat. It's complicated and expensive to measure this or model it. The maximum permissible exposure is a way that you can estimate SAR. So somebody has gone to the work of talking about how much energy can impinge on your body and then will be, at whatever frequency, will be absorbed. As you know, some of it, depending on the frequency, some can pass right through, some gets absorbed inside your body, and some bounces off. As the frequency gets higher and higher, it gets absorbed closer and closer to the skin. The MPE assumes a plane wave exposure. It can talk in different parts of the EM wave. The E field, the electric field, is measured in volts per meter. The H field, or the magnetic field, is measured in amps per meter. And the power density is measured in milliwatts per square centimeter. So here's an example of SAR testing that a manufacturer would do. So they go to some expense to put these things together. And of course, it's required for cell phones, and that's where they make back their money. But they also can do it with any wireless device besides cell phones, like an HT, or even a computer. And they build these phantoms, and they have a robot, because if a person is there making the measurements, putting their hand in, they're disturbing the field, and that gives you results that aren't really reliable. So you set the thing up and you walk out of the room, and the computer controls it, and it runs through and it makes all the measurements of what would be absorbed in a body. Now, you can also model SAR, FTTD or FEM, the two methods that I mentioned, which are not easy for hams to do, but they require exact antenna configurations, and then they're repeated for all orientations. So if you do modeling, you put the phone next to your head, you hold the HT in front of your face like people tend to do, or you might hold it on an angle with your mouth by the speaker, or by the mouthpiece, and the speaker closer to your ear. So that's a different orientation. You can be left-handed, you can be right-handed. There's all kinds of different ways that it can be done, and they will run these models for all of them. And then look at the worst case and try and determine just what is being absorbed in your head. Okay, so let's talk about some issues with SAR. So SAR, specific absorption rate, if a manufacturer goes to the expense of testing its HTs for SAR, will they now pass on the cost to the consumer? We don't know yet. We don't know what the manufacturers are going to do. SAR tests are specific for a particular antenna. So if you as a ham buy a radio, an HT, and then you take the antenna off and put on your own antenna, like you don't like the rubber duck, you'd like something more efficient, that you've just destroyed all of the SAR testing that they did. So you have to somehow repeat that unless you can get them to test different kinds of antennas. And the RF Safety Committee at the ARRL is studying whether existing SAR testing on commercial HTs can be extended to cover HTs in nearby ham bands. For instance, at 2 meters, 144 to 148 is the ham band, but the same manufacturers are selling handheld radios just above that in the 150s and just below that to the government in the 138 to 144 band. So they have to do that testing for those customers. Can we apply that testing to our bands? And we're working on trying to figure that out right now. Okay, so let's talk about some possible future changes. The FCC issued an NPRM. NPRM is a notice of proposed rulemakings, rules they'd like to make, but they have to get a lot of comments on them first, and then they have to analyze the comments, figure if they have to change their proposal, or figure if they're just going to dump it altogether. It's a very long process, especially because up till recently, there was only one person doing it at the FCC for exposure. They've hired on a couple more people just in the last few months. But it's a very big time-consuming job going over all those replies. And you can, if you're interested, you can go see all the replies to anything on the FCC website. So the addition of electrostimulation effects is something mainly below 10 megahertz that is instantaneous. Instead, remember I talked earlier about averaging the exposure over time. Electrostimulation occurs instantaneously. So that will not be averaged over time. That will take effect right away. So that is something that in this NPRM. The extension of high exposure limits to the 100 gigahertz to 3 terahertz bands, probably not something any of you are going to be using, but that is something in this NPRM. And also talking about new localized MPE limits above 6 gigahertz. So they're going to allow maximum permissible exposure instead of SAR to be used at some of the higher frequencies. The one that will have the most effect on hams, obviously, is electrostimulation. And that went out last year, and the replies came in, and they're still analyzing those replies. So we don't know where that's going just yet. Okay, so the next thing is some misconceptions. I want to talk about these because I've been seeing them online, and they really are making the rounds, and a lot of people are up in arms about these exposure rule changes when they don't need to be. So number one, the FCC is not trying to stop you from operating. There are people who have been saying that, but because I go to Washington 4 times a year, and we have our meetings, and I talk with the people at the FCC, and the amateur radio service is a valued FCC service. They care about us. A lot of people don't think so, but they really do. And they go out of their way to make it possible for us to operate. For instance, they have classified us as being part of the occupational group, which gives us higher thresholds of exposure. We're allowed to be exposed more than the guy walking down the street. So there are two thresholds. We're occupational and we get higher thresholds. The reason for that is because we're supposed to have some training and exposure. And if we think that, that we're being overexposed or our family's being overexposed, we can do something about it. And that is what the occupational group is all about. They've provided an exceptions table to allow us to avoid the more detailed assessments from many stations. That's what I went over earlier. Those exceptions allow many hams to avoid going through the heavy calculations. They just go through the little simple calculations that I demonstrated earlier. Okay, another misconception. Equipment, except for HTs, does not have to be certified. Every ham is responsible for confirming that his or her operating does not cause people to be exposed to RF over the FCC thresholds. This responsibility is in our laps. It's not true of any of the other services that the FCC controls. Everyone else has to, they have to do that testing, just like with the HTs. I told you the HTs have to be certified to be under the exposure limits on all the frequencies around the ham frequencies, but not on the ham frequencies. And that's because we are expected to be responsible for confirming that our operating does not cause people to be exposed to RF over the FCC thresholds. And so we get some training in that. There's always a question on each question pool about this. So we obviously have many options for controlling this. To name a few, we can mount our antennas higher. Your neighbor may not like you putting your tower up higher, but the FCC does. That gets your energy far away from people. We can keep people away from our antennas with ropes or signs. We can talk for shorter periods of time because it's all averaged over certain time periods. We can lower our power when necessary, and we can pause operating when people are known to be near our antennas. So we could have an antenna, for instance, that someone walking down the sidewalk could be right next to, and we know that we would be overexposing them. But if we never transmit when they're standing there, that's perfectly legal. We're allowed to do that. It's not important where the antenna is, it's important who's near it. So there are all kinds of ways that we can use to stay legal. And more importantly, to keep from harming anyone with RRF. Okay, so another misconception, oops, skip that. You don't need any special test equipment to meet the exposure requirements. The only thing that's difficult to measure or model is the antenna that is less than 20 centimeters from a human. At that point, that's when they start talking about doing the SARs and what all the stuff I showed you some drawings on of how the manufacturers do it. Anything greater than 20 centimeters from a human, they allow us to use other methods, external methods that we can do, simple calculations that say there's too much exposure. And we can use a modeling tool such as EasyNet and get a much more exact solution. We can also measure it if we have the right equipment, but most hams don't because it has to be calibrated. Often you'll find that no one is exposed above the FCC thresholds when you calculate more exactly. And that in the example I gave earlier, the exclusions or the exemptions that don't take into account everything, which are overly cautious, if you don't qualify for one of those, you will qualify most likely when you do the full analysis. So let me summarize by saying that you should be prepared to perform environmental analyses on your station. The things that allowed us not to do that before are ending come next month. Nothing about the evaluation has changed though. So if you did it before and you already complied then, you'll comply now. You don't need to worry about the SAR limits for handhelds. The manufacturers will be performing that testing when required. And you're being grandfathered in for anything that was made before this May date. Or what date did I say? Is it May 3rd? I forgot which date I said. When this goes into effect, come
May 3rd.
May 3rd, yes. Okay, so come May 3rd, we don't have to worry so much about our handhelds because we're grandfathered in. And we have a 2-year period to comply if we want to use it. They don't think we're going to need it. But if anyone doesn't comply in those 2 years by doing their analysis, well, shame on them. It's not that hard to do. But the main thing is operate safely. Common sense should tell you what to do. It's pretty clear if somebody is walking up and touching your antenna, you shouldn't let them do that while you're transmitting, or don't transmit while he is touching it. So that's the talk. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. Hopefully I answered most of the concerns that people have, because it's amazing some of the scuttlebutt that's out there. But I don't think we need to worry. The FCC is on our side. They are not working against us. So I guess let's open up for questions.
You want to do the first one that I asked you before? Why did they use PEP measurements versus average power? And how will this affect people that do POTA operation or HF magnetic loop antennas, QRP and AM?
Okay, so the PEP or any of the things you mentioned are really related to the exclusion from having to do an assessment.
Greg,
Yeah.
can you lower your desktop? You got your desktop still showing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let's find that. Stop sharing.
There you go.
There you go.
Perfect.
Yeah, now you get to see my face.
Okay.
Does anyone want me to put the desktop back up?
We could see your face before.
That's true. So you know better. Okay, so the things that you're asking about, the things that question is asking about are exemptions to doing the actual analysis. And the only thing that the reason they give you exemptions is they want to give you a lot of leeway to not hurt people. So they're going with the biggest number, which would be PEP.
Okay. Let's see. Will the RF tables made by W5YI and the ARRL in 2010 still be acceptable to use with the new rule?
I'm not even sure what that means. What's RF table? Oh, you said tables. I thought you said
Yeah.
tables.
No, RF table.
I'm sorry, I'm getting old. Yes, well, I'm trying to remember the W5YI RF tables, but if those have to do with the exclusions, and the answer is no. Or exemptions, they were, it was 97.13 B or C of the FCC rules. That's gone now. So that table, and I actually, did I include that? Let me go back in my slides and see if I included that. I can show you what doesn't exist. Okay, I'm going to turn back on my slides and show you one. Man, we're up to 256 participants, this thing says.
We were over 308.
I guess I was kind of boring.
No?
Let's see, how do I put this back on? Share screen. Okay, you see that? Previous categorical exclusions?
Okay.
So in the past, if you transmitted less than this power, these powers on these different bands, you were categorically excluded. And as I described before, you didn't have to do you weren't required to do the full analysis. I don't really think the analysis is so tough to do, but for people who didn't want to do it, you didn't have to. So that doesn't exist anymore. 97.13C is gone from the new rules come whatever the on date for that is next month.
Okay.
So everybody, now that is replaced by this table. These are called exemptions, not exclusions, but that's replaced by this table. So where you may have avoided doing an analysis before, now you have to do some analysis. Not a complete analysis, but you have to do some analysis. This analysis includes the frequency, obviously, the distance away in meters away from the antenna, between the closest point of an antenna and a person, and the frequency that the antenna is operating at. So you can be exempt from doing any further analysis if you do this analysis. Before, you were exempt or excluded, it was called an exclusion before, just by saying I'm operating less than this amount of power. Now you have to figure some things out. The other one didn't make a lot of sense in certain instances. It was possible for someone to go up and touch your antenna while you're transmitting. That's not allowed. That's certainly not allowed under this. But under the old rules, it looked like it would be allowed. Now, there's a caveat in the old rules that a lot of people forgot about, that you're not allowed to overexpose anyone, regardless of whether you're exempt from performing the analysis or not. So they gave themselves an out. Did that answer your question well enough? Whoever asked it?
It sounds okay to me, so
Yeah, Greg, it's me. I asked you, that's the one I asked you prior to the meeting started, so that's fine.
Okay.
Very good.
And that's why they changed the word from exclusion to exemption.
Right, okay.
Always excluded.
And Greg, just to be clear, if you put that back up.
Okay. Sure. I'm getting good at this. Slideshow. Okay, do you want to go back to the other?
Yeah, go back to that for just a second, just to be clear.
Okay. This was actually in part 97 before.
Yeah, but the formula, just to be clear on the formula, we put it back up.
But this is gone now. This
I'm
whole
talking about the new.
Oh, the new.
formula
Okay.
for
So
calculating.
let me just say the 97.13C, if you were to download the latest release of the rules, this would not be in it.
Yeah, I agree, but put the replacement up.
Okay. There you go. So this is
Yeah, we don't
Right.
see
Not
it.
up.
You're not shared yet.
You're not seeing the thing that says frequency, megahertz threshold, ERP?
No.
Nope,
You're not sharing screen yet.
you haven't shared your desktop yet.
You're seeing my face. Oh, sorry about that.
Not much you can do about that.
Okay, I have to hit that button. How are we doing now?
Looking a lot better.
Okay, so just to be clear about the formula, F is in megahertz, R is in meters, the distance, and it must be greater than the wavelength divided by 2 pi.
Okay,
Correct.
which is the way they call the reactive near field. That's the point roughly at which the reactive near field changes into the non-reactive near field.
And if you are indeed in the reactive near field, what is the calculation to use?
Well, then in that case, you have to do an SAR. You can't do this calculation anymore. So now it gets a little confusing because that has to do with the exemptions. So you cannot take an exemption from doing an analysis if you are within that reactive near field. That
I get it.
doesn't mean that you can't calculate it out. You can still calculate it out without using SAR.
Correct, okay, thank you.
So they rewrote the rules to not allow exemptions if you're that close to the antenna. And as I had in another slide, that close to the antenna sometimes isn't that close. Say at 80 meters, it's 41 feet away. So that's not that close. But as far as RF goes, that is close.
But that is not taking into account power.
That's correct. So the exemption, again, is not, let me go back. The exemption says that if you are calculating a power, okay? If you can't take the exemption, then you have to do a regular analysis, which will calculate power. It's a little confusing because the exemption really is not a full calculation. They're trying to make it a little easier for us.
May I comment on, I saw a chart. Of all the figures I saw, there were 316 pages, starting with the FCC, or with the ARRL, ending up with the FCC. There was a chart at page 311 that basically stated, in my opinion, that if you could operate 1,000 watts, as long as your antenna was 35 feet away from you, and that was only on one band. And I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do.
But that simplifies everything if that chart works.
So the reason for that, and take a look at how these numbers work. You can.
Greg, let me interject here for just a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's not just be jumping in. I got 2 people holding their hands up. They're waiting. I understand the question. Greg, go ahead and answer the question, but you hold your hand up or put a question in the chat so we don't start doubling on top of each other and getting all out of sort here. Okay, Greg.
You just give it to whoever wants to ask.
Okay, so are we moving on now, or?
Yeah, I don't think.
Okay.
There's
All
more
right.
of that question.
Barry, let's take a couple of these hands up.
Go right ahead.
Go ahead, Oscar.
Greg, thank you for your great presentation. And you already mentioned tools. Definitely, that would be one of the best, probably a good explanation on the ARRL website and the tools to utilize to do the analysis if we have an exemption or we have to do the real calculation based of every station power and most probably now that it's included the distance. If the tool, my question is, does the tool, you can put like a sketch of your land, of your patio, so on, for the near neighbor, or people that can walk as close of the closest point or so on. So that way you can be sure that you are within the control area and in a safe radiation pattern. That's my question.
Oscar, it's a good question, but you'll find those tools exist, but they're not really available to most hams. And it's not easy to even build those models. But you'll find that the way these rules, the numbers in these rules, those things don't come up much. Let me try and think of an example. Let's go to the example that I gave. Where was that? Where did I put that example? The one that I showed you, the example at between 20 and 10 meters. And I did the calculations at 10 meters. So the distances that we were talking about were just under 15 feet away from the antenna. That's pretty close to an antenna. Now, if you start running kilowatts, it gets a little further, but it falls off pretty quickly. How would I do that for you? Well, I'm not going to do these calculations in my head, but it is not outrageous to run a kilowatt and keep people far enough away from your antenna so they won't get overexposed. It is not a really huge distance.
So it comes also into thinking or analyzing what happens if you are under the antenna. It's a vertical. That means that you are completely out of the pattern of the antenna because you have a null.
You're talking about like a roof-mounted vertical?
Yes.
Okay, so then you would have to run the analysis of that one.
Phone is ringing.
That's one you'd have to analyze with a program that tells you how much energy is underneath the antenna. It will tell you there's not much.
Thank you.
We're trying to put together tools that most hams can use to the simple things, and then for the harder things, then we'll have to figure out what tools we have to run those special cases. And we're working on that right now. My RF safety committee, and I believe some of them are probably among the 215 people listening right now, but we're going over that right now to try and figure the easiest way for hams to be compliant. But the ones we want to do the majority cases first. The ground mounted vertical is very common. The dipoles are very common. And the roof mounted vertical, I did that once, but only once. It was too hard to maintain, so I put it down on the ground.
Okay, let's take one more off the hands up, and then we'll go back to the text things here. Glenn, go ahead.
Oh, very good. Hope you can copy me. What about being inside a structure? I'm relatively close to my antenna, but I'm in a stucco structure with chicken wire and all of that. What about derating for your average home structure?
Well, where I live, the average home structure is wood, so that doesn't work. But I get your point. These are pretty much special cases where you have to figure out just how much shielding you have. You're essentially in a somewhat shielded room. So you got to figure out how much shielding you actually have and make allowances for that. It certainly gives you a lot more leeway. I also think that when you start doing some of these analyses, you're going to find the numbers are much smaller than you expected. So it may not even be a concern.
Okay, let's do from the hands up and move to the text chat questions, and we'll get back to the hands in a second.
Okay. Tony K10C asks, are you measuring from the vertical element or from the edge of the ground plane, i.e. the ends of any radials?
Well, I would personally measure from the vertical element on a vertical antenna.
Okay.
The grounds, though the grounds are not really at ground, for exposure purposes, you can assume they are.
Okay. I'm sure that's all right. Okay. There's a question, I'm not sure that we can answer it here, but how can how can ERP from an antenna be calculated?
Well, depending which antenna you've got, it's the directionality is a big part of it, and we're starting off simple with the the verticals and the dipoles. But if you have a beam, then your ERP changes over the whole all around it. Now, if let me see, in the exemptions, they don't take directionality into account. There's nowhere in the exemptions that allow you to put in a directionality. You just have to assume that it's everywhere, all around the antenna in every direction. It's not realistic, but it's being very conservative. So if you pass that, you're done. If you don't, then you'd start analyzing for directionality.
Okay. This next one is interesting. How do you do the math for a field day site at a public park where you have 8 HF transmitters plus a GOTA station? Do they have to do 9 HF calculations for each band and then add them?
Yes, and it's not easy, but what year was it? Many years ago, my let's see, my son who just got his doctorate was like 10 years old at the time, and we had an article in QST about just kind of what partly the question you're asking about doing an exposure assessment at the field day site. And I got to remember what year that was, but it was a long time ago.
Okay. And someone made a comment that you could also reduce your transmit power about 28.6 megahertz.
Yes, you
Some
could.
people can't, or some people won't, put it that way.
Well,
Okay.
the key is that you're in control. So
Right.
if you've done the calculations and you decide what you have to do, you do it.
Yep. And what does this mean for a mobile radio with an antenna mounted on the roof? Probably depends on how much power the mobile radio is putting out.
That is correct. And again, the exclusions kind of give you a lot of leeway there.
Okay. So some people, look, this is for some antennas, certain wire ones, the feed line is considered part of the antenna. Does this mean that you need to measure from the feed line?
That's a good question. You're talking about the ladder line, and that's actually one I haven't considered. But I would say that if you could measure radiation off the feed line, which you shouldn't be able to, but if you can measure it, then you have to consider it. If you have a balanced ladder line, I don't think you get any radiation off if it's perfectly balanced.
Okay. Okay. Now, cell phones are done by the manufacturer, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, they are.
Okay. Does absorption vary from person to person? I.e., are fair-skinned people more likely to be overexposed?
Oh,
Like they are for the sun.
a question I haven't considered, but I would say probably not.
Okay.
There's no difference at
Okay.
the longer wavelengths.
Let's take one more off the text thing and then go back to the raised hands.
Okay. What would happen if you have access to a personal radiation monitor? I'm not sure what that is.
That's what they give professionals who work on towers to know
Okay.
how much they're being exposed.
Okay.
You're perfectly, that's the nice thing about the way these rules are written, is you can use any method that works.
Okay. Let's go back to your hand, Ken.
Okay, Q6HE, you want to take it?
Yeah, did you say KQ6HE?
Yeah, that's the guy. Go ahead.
Okay, now I have a pouch that attaches to my belt. And when I put the HT in that pouch, the antenna is touching my abdomen. Also, I have a chest mount. And in that case, the antenna is, close to my shoulder. So what's the power limit when the HT antenna, I'm talking about 5 watts, when the HT antenna is almost touching your body?
Well, do you plan to have any kids? Just kidding. That was a joke. Probably not a good joke, but so the HT from just like your cell phone, just like everything else, that cell phone antenna is almost touching your body. The calculations take that into account, and that's why at those short distances they don't let you use MPE. You have to use SAR. So let me add to that. When you, in the future, when you buy an HT, the company will have done this assessment for you.
Well, I see the police radios are the same way. They have a pouch, the portable radios on their belt. So their antenna is close to their body also.
A lot of them have it up on their shoulder, but you're right. And but in those cases, you can probably look those up, from Kenwood. But that's public information. You can look up what they filed with the FCC for that analysis because they have to.
Okay, we're ready to move on here. Zach, you want to take it?
Yeah, thank you. So great presentation, by the way. I just kind of had a little bit of a clarification question. You know, you were talking about the reactive near field distance there, and you know, if you're within, you know, that your R has to be greater than that reactive near field distance. So, and I noticed you put that chart up there, and it was somewhere around, I believe, 82 feet was the calculation for 160 meters. So just to clarify, does that mean that 160 meter antenna, if it's within 82 feet of somebody, you have to run SAR calculations?
No, that is something that the FCC gave us. They probably think we should, but they know that it's not possible. It's not going to happen. So they gave us the ability to do an analysis without SAR, with MP, even that close in. But you can't take the exemption. That's the difference. They don't let you take an exemption that close in, but you can then run the calculation with MPEs.
Okay, thanks.
Now, let me clarify something there too, because that's something that we're working with. If you're in the reactive near field, it's not a nice smooth plane wave like you've got out in the far field or even in the, outside the reactive near field. So you have to determine where the hot spots are and calculate for those. It's not easy. It's one that we're still working with them on to figure out what's the best way to do it.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll take one more for the hands and go back to the chat stuff. Go ahead, Jim.
That KF5 TPT?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that may have just answered my question. I had to leave a little bit to a more pressing Zoom meeting, but I'll watch the rest of the videos. So you may have answered this. I have a 160 meter loop up 25 feet, and most I ever do is 800 watts. So do I need to do anything special?
Yeah, you need to do the analysis. That's all.
Okay, so even though I'm on an acre lot and I don't have
well, you need to do the analysis to where people are going to be found. So
Okay.
if you can guarantee that no one's ever going to walk under that antenna while you're transmitting, then you don't have to analyze it.
Yeah, it's just me, my wife, and the dogs.
Unfortunately, the FCC doesn't care about your dogs.
Okay, let's go back to the chat questions there for a little bit.
Okay, someone made the comment that the handheld radio manufacturers are going to probably have to change their manuals and say, hold the radio in this position only.
They may. It depends how they test.
Yep. Okay, let's see. Can you speak to the proposed fines or sanctions for non-compliance?
I don't really know. I don't think the FCC is planning on non-compliance. They expect us to comply, and like with most things with ham radio, you can get away with a lot if you wanted to, but most hams don't want to.
Right. Okay. Since the MPE limits themselves are not changing, can we continue to use existing RF safety calculators, like the ones that they were talking about before, to demonstrate that we are below the MPEs?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Chapter 5 says that 50% duty factor means 20 minutes out of 30, not 15. Is that the correct method to use?
I never used it that way. I just go straight time. If you're talking for 30 minutes, or if you're on for 30 minutes and you talk for 15 minutes, the only thing that is important with that is is your total time period. So the time period for us as occupational is much shorter than the time period for the guy walking by on the sidewalk. So you have to take all that into account, whether it's the 6 minutes or the 30 minutes.
Okay. And Ray from W7CIA once said, his antenna does not appear in any tables and I'm unable to locate gain information for the antennas. It's a balanced, terminated, folded dipole. What do you do for the cases where antenna gains are not listed in the reference documents?
I would use NEC, the easy NEC that is all over the place. I don't know if it's free or it's cheap, but it's available.
Okay. Let's see. What about HTs that are a belt holder, so the antenna is touching the person? What is the power limit in that case on 2 meters?
Well, again, they were exempted. So if you got it, if you got it today, or if it was made up till next month, then you don't worry. You don't need to worry about it. After that, if you buy something that was made after they decide what they're going to do with it, but they're probably going to use SARs, and that's something beyond your abilities.
Right. Okay. Zach asks, going back to the sidewalk example, if your antenna is 4 meters from the sidewalk and 3 meters up in the air, do you use trigonometric principles to determine the true distance from the antenna?
Yeah.
5 meters in this example, according to the Pythagorean theorem.
Yes, that's correct. So if the radiating part of your antenna is mounted up in the air,
okay,
you use that. Use it in your favor. Just like a horizontal antenna, you use the distance that's up there in your favor.
Okay. For 440 megahertz, what would be the new formula be? 0.0128 times R, in parentheses, times F?
Well, if you're talking about near field or farther away?
I imagine 440, it's a handheld, so it will probably be near field.
So if it's a handheld at 440, then none of those equations work because you have to do SAR.
Okay. Okay. Glenn asks, he presumes the calculations are based on a moment in time, i.e. in any given moment in time versus how long a person may be exposed. Example, a person passing through or in the RF field may be exposed for X seconds or minutes versus the calculation of a literal moment. Just another variable, Greg. Thanks for an excellent presentation on a truly difficult topic.
Well, you're very welcome, but don't forget that there's an averaging time. So if it's a person right off the street walking by, it's a 30-minute averaging time.
Okay.
So that means if they walk through your and get highly exposed to your antenna for 1 minute and nothing else for the other 29 minutes, chances are they're under the limit.
Okay.
Okay, can I hear for a second, Barry?
Sure. I think we're almost done anyway.
Okay, well, I just received a complaint here in text saying that those of, when we go to the hands raised, we're cutting short the guys that have had the questions in text for a long time. A lot of guys have got questions in the chats had it there during the time the thing was going on. We're just trying to be as fair as possible, get back and forth.
There's only one hand held up now, if you want to go ahead and do him.
I will do that, but I just want to explain why I was doing what I was doing, and
Okay.
everybody's unhappy.
And we'll get through these questions as soon as we can.
Yes, we will, Barry. Yes, we will. Okay, Howard, go ahead.
Well, thank you for calling. I mean, I appreciate the detailed explanations that you did here, Greg. It's a lot of work. Is there a relationship between SWR and ERP? In other words, if you have a high SWR, will that lower your ERP at your antenna base?
It would, just because not all of the energy is going out the antenna.
But it doesn't look like your form. I'm not a mathematician, but it doesn't look like there's a calculation for that in the formula.
So the form, you're talking about the exclusion formula?
Yes.
So the exclusion formula is very conservative. It is nowhere near what you're able to transmit. It just allows you to say you know that it's safe, or that it's way under the limit. It's not at the limit, it's way under the limit. So if you fail that, the exemption, then you start doing calculations using real numbers. The reality.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much.
Sure, you're welcome.
Let's we're down the very few. Let's just take one more hand up there, Paul.
You know what? Before we go on, let me say one thing, because I think this is coming up multiple times. That it's the amount of exposure is not, unless you run California kilowatts. The amount of exposure that you're allowed to have is not much of a limit. You don't hit it very often if you do the calculations correctly. So the concern, I think people have been over concerned about these rules coming into effect. They're more worried than they need to be.
Okay. Phil, you want to take the last one from the hands raised? Phil, okay, there you go.
Yep, there we go. Greg, good evening. Thank you for the valuable information. I've done the MPE calculations based both on actual calculated ERP and using the watts delivered minus the loss in the feed line to the feed point to the antenna. Which is the preferred value, your ERP or the actual watts delivered? Because the ERP works out in my case to be about 864 watts. And the values are a little bit different. I'm still compliant, but I'm just curious as to which is the preferred value.
I'm not clear what you're asking, Phil. Is when you say using the ERP versus the that doesn't take into account feed line loss? Is that what you're saying?
No. I said I calculated the ERP taking into consideration the 0.9 dB for 100 feet of loss in the 9913.
Okay.
Okay. And the original formula for the MPE calculator calls just for the wattage delivered to the feed point. Do they want the watts coming out of the back of the amplifier, or do they want the ERP? That's where I'm confused.
Oh, okay. Well, I got mixed up. ERP really stands for how much is actually radiated off the antenna. So you're talking about what appears at the feed point is the important number. So if you take what's coming out of the back of your radio, subtract what gets lost in the feed line, that's the number you should use.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'm sorry, Joe, you just came in there and we got some people waiting on the chat, so we'll get back to you. Go ahead, Barry.
Okay, what specific forms do we need to use to keep for our records for the MPE, if anything?
There is no specific form. You just take notes and just keep them around in case anyone ever asks. And that's very, by the way, very unlikely.
Okay, and I think you addressed the time average concept again with respect to power output allowed. Let's see. In the future, will manufacturer of SAR measurements preclude the use of third-party antennas on a SAR measured radio?
So that's something that we're talking to the FCC about. We do not want them, and by we, I mean including the ARRL's lawyer. We really don't want them to change the status of hams because of this. So we're treading very carefully to try and get them to allow us to do our own calculations and to meet their requirements. But with the SAR, it makes it a little more difficult. So one of the members of the RF Safety Committee, who's probably listening in tonight, he has proposed using the commercial SAR from the bands that surround the ham bands. For instance, just above 2 meters, there are police radios where they have to do these calculations. And below, there's government radios where they have to do these calculations. And if we're right in between, he is trying to find out if they'll allow us just to use their calculations and interpolate them into our space. And in that case, we don't have to do those calculations ourselves. We just use I'm sorry, not calculations. We don't have to use measurements ourselves. We use theirs. So that's what, and that way, if we can continue doing things like that, then we can, as long as we can work it out, they allow us to use any reliable calculation. If we can make something that's realistic, we can stay away from having to join their certifications, because that's something we want to avoid. For one thing, it prevents hams from experimenting. So we want to be able to experiment, and that's the argument we're making to them.
Wait, does that answer it?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, what did you say, Barry?
Does that answer the question for the person that asked?
Are there any more in chat?
Yes. For an HF Manpack radio set, how would you work the exposure study? Obviously, it's an HF radio and it's right up against your body almost. Like in a backpack.
Haven't really thought about that one. That's a good one, but I know people who can model that. It's not easily modeled with the tools that we have.
Okay.
Or possibly it is. We'd have to talk to some of our modeling experts to find out if that can be done with the models that we have access to.
Okay. Are there simple measurements we can use to demonstrate compliance in cases that involve near-field exposure?
Well, it's simple, but not, in that it has to, if you use an instrument to do measurements, it has to have a calibration.
Okay. Okay.
So that may not be so simple. So I'm sorry, say again?
That was my question, and I'm asking, can you expand on that a little bit more? When you say it has to be calibrated, I mean, obviously, we're going to be measuring the thing with calibration. But what are we looking for? Are we looking for field intensity, for example? And I assume there's a difference between E field and B field, or H field, I guess.
Well, typically at the higher frequencies, it's the combined field, and then you separate out E and H as you get lower in frequency. So down at the very lowest frequencies, I think H is preferred. And then up in the HF bands, it's more E.
I would think it'd be the other way about.
Is it that was? It's not my expertise, but I'm pretty sure that's the way it was. But it's one or the other. And then as you get higher in frequency, they specify the power field.
But I guess, the question is, regardless of whatever it is, would the FCC accept that as your demonstration that you are compliant?
I think they would, yes.
Okay.
And especially if we're talking about, I'm not sure where are you talking about HF or VHF or just anything?
Just in general, just looking for what they would accept for demonstration of compliance.
There are experts I've talked to in this field, and these aren't FCC, but there are experts I've talked to who say you really have to, at the lower frequencies, the long wavelengths, you have to measure both if you're close in. If you're in the far field, it doesn't matter. But I don't know enough to answer that. The person, if Rick is on, maybe he can speak up because he might have a better answer for you. Rick Tell, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good evening, Greg. Yeah, the answer is that certainly below 30 megahertz, both E and H have to both comply with the MPEs. So you'd have to characterize both of them via measurement or calculation. So basically, that's sort of like saying if you're in the reactive field area, you need to measure or calculate both of those field parameters, and both of them have to comply.
Okay. Yeah, I would imagine the H field's only important if you've got a pacemaker.
Yeah.
Means it would be important.
Okay.
Very important.
There's important and then there's rules.
Yeah.
Joel, you've lowered your hand. Did you get your question answered?
Well, yes, sir. Pretty much for the most part. Between George and Howard, he pretty much answered my question. But I guess to recap, if you've got a 50-foot tower, 3-element beam, you're a DX chaser, and you're running a kilowatt and a half, full legal limit, and you're in row housing, you're probably going to end up having to do the calculation.
True.
Okay, go ahead, Barry, back to the chat.
Okay. So shouldn't one add the antenna gain to the power delivered to the feed point to get ERP?
Yes.
Okay. And someone made a comment that changing antennas on an HT issue is why on FRS and GMRS radios, the antennas must be fixed and non-changeable because they don't want you to change the exposure.
Well, to expand on that, hams are the only ones who are allowed to do that kind of stuff because we have that control. So the commercial world does not.
Right. And this one is an interesting question. A mobile HF radio with a screwdriver antenna mounted on the vehicle, is one required to stop transmitting if people are nearby, like in a campground? Depending on how close they are, I guess.
I'm guessing, I don't operate mobile, but I'm guessing 100 watts is pretty much what you do in your car. You don't do more than that?
Well, some people. I've seen some people that run a kilowatt in mobile, so.
That is a concern, and that if someone's walking right next to your antenna. However, you'll find at HF that the distances are pretty short, the compliance distances. Maybe not for a kilowatt. For 100 watts,
yeah,
people probably aren't walking that close to your car.
Okay. And that's all the questions in the chat, Dan. Do we have any hands? Let's see, hold on, just one more. Just to confirm, non-licensed spouses and family members are considered non-occupational for calculations, and there are no separate dosage limits for children, correct?
What is correct is not completely that. There are not separate dosages for different size people, including children, but your family, the hams family, is considered in the environment or in the occupational group. So you can expose your family just as much as you can expose yourself.
Okay. That comes to the end of all the stuff in the chat then.
Okay, I have a question. It sounds like, although this is going to kick off May 3rd, that since you're still trying to work with the FCC to make changes and add proposals and stuff like that, this thing's still in flux right now. It's not really, it's more like jello than concrete. Is that a fair statement there, Greg?
No, it's kind of interesting the way they do it. I'll say the fair statement is yes and no. They write the rules, and it goes through those rules took years and years, decades to finally get out there. However, some of the details of the rules aren't included in the rules. And that goes into the FCC labs, the OET lab. And they create documents, I'm trying to remember the name of those documents, actually, let me see if I can pull one up. That kind of
KDB.
Say again, Rick?
KDB.
KDBs, thank you. So the KDBs are not official rules. They weren't voted on by the commission, and they didn't go through the whole process of having comments and reply comments, etc. But that is the way the lab tells people how they should conform to the rules. So the KDB process, or the KDBs, which are online if you want to look them up, tell different, at the point they're not writing any KDBs for hams, but the KDBs for commercial radio users tell them how they have to meet the rules. So that's the OET labs, and they write those things, and they're going to be adding a little ham radio section for some of these new rules for the first time.
Interesting. Okay, are there any comments out there?
Just one question.
Sure, go right ahead.
Yeah, NV6B here, Paul. I was wondering about antennas on RVs when we're trying to do these calculations, and we've got, whether it be a mobile antenna on an RV or a vertical like a butternut or something mounted on top of the RV, even though the RV is shielded somewhat. It's not a very good Faraday shield, but if that would make much difference on our calculations.
All right, so you're worried about irradiating the people in the RV versus the people walking by?
Yeah, more so, because most of the time we're away from everybody else.
Okay. That is one of those situations where you have to calculate, actually run a calculator and calculate the patterns coming off of that antenna. Very often, though, they don't go down; they go up. So if it's sitting on top of your RV, and there's mostly metal there, I would guess, you won't see much on the inside.
Well, that's good. That's what I've been doing. So that helps a lot. Thanks, Greg. It was a great presentation, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Beware, guys, the new cars are not all made out of metal anymore. Mag mounts don't even stick on them.
Well, I had a Saturn once.
I have one question here. My antenna is a vertical. This question was almost asked before about height off the ground. My vertical is way up on top of the house, and the very bottom of the antenna is at least 25 feet off the ground. And so that's the closest anybody could ever get to it. Would that be the distance I use, the very bottom of that antenna?
Well, you have to figure out what the fields off the antenna are. If you have a good ground plane up there, or if it's a type that doesn't need a ground plane, the chances are you can look at the manufacturer's patterns coming off the antenna, and if you don't see anything going straight down, then there's a good chance that you don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, this antenna uses no radios. It has a top hat, so I'll have to check. It's an old antenna, but I'll check on that. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Okay, I got two more in the chat, Dan.
Okay, go for it.
One is on the exemption minimum distances, is 100 watts assumed.
I'm trying to think of what minimum distances you're talking about.
Carlos, you want to pop in and ask?
Yeah, on the chart. Yeah, hi. It's on the chart that you put out. It talks about 160 meters to 82 feet, and then goes as far down as.
Okay, I know what you're talking about now.
Yeah.
Okay, so what that chart represents is the lambda over 2pi. That's the the reactive near field.
Correct.
So that's the point at which you can no longer take exemptions inside that space.
Correct. Are those distances based on 100 watts, or what was that based on?
No, that's not based on any power at all. That's just based on your ability to do calculations.
Okay.
You can't calculate, in other words, that puts you inside the reactive near field. And in the reactive near field, we're having some discussions in our RF safety committee about this, but it's my understanding that the field is so non-smooth or non-linear that you can hit a hot spot or you can hit a cold spot and it changes drastically.
Okay. Because my concern is, because of the covenants, I'm restrictive on the type of antenna I can have, and I have an end-fed inverted L.
Okay.
So that's what I'm trying to figure out. Probably I'm going to have to take the horizontal element height below it, as well as the vertical, correct?
Well, let me explain and apologize at the same time. Without having a antenna calculating program to get the fields off your antenna, we are going out there and getting the path of least resistance first. Most hams will have a vertical or a dipole, and we're getting the numbers for those first. For things that have pattern or near field patterns that are unusual, you'd have to calculate it somehow, the near field pattern, to really know.
Okay.
But again, at those longer wavelengths, lower frequencies, you'll notice on the exclusion, on the old charts, it's pretty high powers. And the reason for it is that you're very unlikely to get exposed by that type of an antenna.
Okay. Fair enough. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hey, Greg, I was just going to say that the R value in those formulas or those that table is related to the distance to the nearest point anywhere on the antenna. So that would include, if there were radials, for example, elevated radials, it would be to the nearest point of any part of the antenna. It's not just to what you might think to be the active radiating, the main part of the antenna.
But Rick, let me put a caveat in there too. Say you have radios laying on the ground that go out for miles or long distances. I don't think that what you said would apply to those.
I'm just trying to read what it says in the paragraph. It just said it was any part of the antenna.
Okay. But the ground radios in the ground, I think those are considered ground, at ground potential and not radiating.
Yeah, they're counterplots. They're not radiators.
It says any part of the antenna. That's all I was commenting on.
Right. No, it's a good point, Rick, and it's probably something we need to clarify for a ground-mounted versus a sky-mounted.
And for example, the gentleman that was just talking about the in-fed antenna, so it'd be right where it starts at the feed point, down near the ground. So the vertical part, whatever the closest point is to where somebody could be, that's where that R is supposed to go calculate from.
Okay, there's a lot of flexibility here, some questions in the gray zone and such. Will there be a place that the ham can go to, the ARL, wherever, that they could ask these additional questions as they come up?
That's a good question. I don't think we've set anything like that up. Usually they go to Ed Hare. first, and he'll pass it on to us if he can't answer it.
You know,
But-
there's a lot of people who do not know who Ed is.
That surprises me. I thought everyone knows who Ed is.
Well, we have, when it comes to the amateur world, they are all members. I wish they all were, but they're not all. And a lot of those members are not, they're active on different areas, VHF and this kind of stuff. So their expertise and who that call is kind of, you know, it varies.
Of course, yeah. No, I was kind of joking about Ed, but he does
Okay.
get around.
Okay, I got two more from the chat, and then we can wrap up.
Okay.
Will the questions and answers from this online conversation and others be considered in the ARL response to the new rules? And Eric AE7UF from Idaho asks that.
The responses to the new rules are already in and considered, and that's the new rules are going into effect.
Okay.
There is an NPRM where they're considering even more new rules. And they have already gotten all the responses and they haven't read them all yet.
Okay.
That's nowhere near becoming rules.
Okay. Joel AL7PQ asks, after this, where can he go to access all of these formulas?
We have a place on the ARRL website, which we're fixing up right now. But we have an RF safety area, and we'll be adding to it.
Okay.
In the interim, when I post this video today, I'll also be posting his presentation, which has a lot of those formulas in it.
Oh, that will be nice. Thanks.
And one more. For a dipole, is the distance the closest point anyone can be at any point on the wire?
I think that question means what are you worried about? And yes, it's any part of the wire is considered the closest distance for a person.
Okay.
Now, if you can do a more exact analysis and show that that's not correct. It's not uniform across the whole wire. But that's usually more work than anyone wants to go to because the distances are pretty small, typically.
Okay, well, that finishes up, but hold on, wait. What factor is applied to maximum exposure to occupational versus general public?
Oh, Rick, do you know that? I think it's 2.5, but
5. Figure 5 in terms of power density.
Okay.
So occupational is 5 times more or less restrictive than for general public, power density wise.
Okay, that finishes up the chat, Dan.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a longer than normal one, but I think it's been well worth our time. We had over 300 in there at the very last part. You have to understand on the East Coast, it is very late right now. And poor Oscar's over there. He's got toothpicks over in Puerto Rico to keep his eyelids open. So a lot of people will be watching the videos on this to follow up. I appreciate your time. And Greg, I really appreciate you putting this presentation on for us.
Yes, most definitely. Thank everybody for coming.
Thank you all for listening, because this is the best way to get everyone to be operating the right way.
I think it's a huge start. Go the right way. Yes. Thank you.
Nice job, Greg.
All right.
Thank you very much.
With this, I'm going to say 7301, pull the plug, and we have another presentation tomorrow. So hopefully I see some of you then. 73s now.
If anyone's interested in the Coast Guard Auxiliary is going to be on tomorrow night.
All right.
Thanks, Dan.
73s.
73s, everybody.
Night, everybody.
All right.
Everybody, good night.
Thanks again.